Part 3. The Irish Referencing Report. Jim Murray represents Ireland on the EQF Advisory Group, which has been established by the European Commission to coordinate implementation of the EQF at European level. Jim is Director of Framework Implementation and Qualifications Recognition at the National Qualifications Authority. Jim chaired the National Steering Committee for referencing the NFQ to the EQF.
Our steering committee was designed to be convincing. It consisted of all of the public authorities, awarding bodies that make the qualifications in our framework. We wanted to show that we had a real framework with real qualifications, and the bodies that were responsible for making these qualifications were part of the referencing process. These included all of the bodies in higher further education and the school sector, but also the Qualifications Authority itself, which is the body responsible through legislation for overseeing the framework. And by having all of these groups and bodies working together, we were showing that the process was authoritative and that it had a guaranteed legitimacy.
The EQF Advisory Group, which was established to coordinate and oversee the implementation of EQF at European level, has developed a set of criteria and procedures to guide the referencing process. Our National Steering Committee prepared a report which created a response to each of those 10 criteria and procedures. Now, each of the criteria and procedures are important and each of those need to be included in every country's national report, but there are a number of those which we'd like to highlight here.
Edwin Mrena joined the National Steering Committee as a consultant. Edwin has worked extensively with qualifications frameworks in Ireland and internationally. He was one of the original development team for the Irish framework, and he has also been closely involved in the development of the EQF. Edwin undertook the detailed technical comparison of the NFQ level descriptors with the EQF level descriptors.
My role arose out of the need to address criterion 2 in the EQF referencing criteria, which is to demonstrate a link between the levels in the Irish framework and the EQF levels. And so my task was to look at this from a technical perspective and see could we establish such a link. But we felt this needed to be done in a thorough way so that whatever results we came up with would be as definitive as possible. Now the issues here are fairly simple. There are 8 levels in the EQF. There are 10 levels in the Irish framework, so they needed to be reconciled. But then underlying that, there's the issue that the Irish framework is quite a complex entity. It describes each of its levels using 8 sets of statements, whereas EQF is a lot simpler. It describes its levels using just 3 sets of statements for each. So we needed, in the first instance, to establish that it was valid to compare 2 entities that appear to be quite different in that respect. So to begin with, we looked at the origins of the 2 frameworks, the purposes for which they were designed, the core concepts on which they are based, and in particular the technical aspects of how the levels are constructed. And from this we were able to establish what I think is a decent rationale for comparing the 2 frameworks, even though you're comparing a complex entity with a simpler entity. We had already undertaken comparison of the Irish framework with other frameworks several times. In particular, we had recently completed the establishment of compatibility of the Irish levels with the Bologna framework cycles in higher education in Europe. And using the same approach as we used there, we then went on and undertook a detailed technical cross-referencing of the statements that define the Irish levels and the statements that define the EQF levels. From an early stage in that process, it became clear that there was a strong correspondence between the EQF level 6 and Irish level 8. And that gave us a fixed point from which we could then build up and build down and eventually come up with correspondence between each Irish level and the appropriate level in EQF. The findings are that the 2 frameworks while not identical, are comparable in many respects, and that in particular we can demonstrate an alignment between each of the Irish levels and an appropriate EQF level. And so we would feel that this more than adequately meets the requirements of criterion 2 in the EQF referencing criteria.
The NFQ is required in law to be based on learning outcomes. The legislation requires that the National Qualifications Authority establish and maintain a framework for the development, recognition and award of qualifications in the state based on standards of knowledge, skill or competence. These general strands were further subdivided into 8 sub-strands.
Significant activity has been undertaken in terms of implementing the learning outcomes approach of the national framework. Examples would include the setting of generic disciplinary standards by the Higher Education and Training Awards Council for use in its sector, and the development of an associated assessment policy. The Further Education and Training Awards Council has developed a common award system, and this is very significant for qualifications within its sector. And of course, the work of the University Framework Implementation Network is important. The Framework Implementation Network was established by the Irish Universities Association and the Qualification Authority in 2007, and it's designed to facilitate the implementation of learning outcomes and the implementation of the national framework within the university sector.
Details of the policies and arrangements for the validation of non-formal and informal learning are provided in the referencing report, as well as details of the links to credit systems.
The Qualification Authority has developed a range of policies and procedures to allow the inclusion of a whole host of qualifications in the national framework. The Qualification Authority identified that there are 4 main groups of awarding bodies that we would seek to have their qualifications included, and this allows the recognition of all awards and all learning within the national framework. Full details of these policies and procedures are published on the NQAL website.
Quality assurance is a fundamental principle at the heart of the framework. It's what makes the framework tick. And when I talk about quality assurance, I'm talking about all dimensions of quality assurance in our education and training system. This includes the providers, how they are quality assured, the programs that they are offered, that they offer, how these are quality assured, the learning outcomes achieved by learners, how are they assessed and the quality guaranteed, and how is the certification processes that the awarding bodies operate in making the awards, how are they guaranteed by quality. So what we were trying to do was to capture all of this and show that quality operates not just as a principle, but as a day-to-day reality in the system. In the referencing process, what we wanted to show was that all parts of our education and training system, from the schools through further education and training to our higher education sector, including the universities and the other colleges that make up the system, that all of these have quality systems and that they're all linked in very clearly to the framework. In the report itself, there were 2 formal requirements in terms of showing our commitment to quality and how it underpins the framework. The first of these was simply, and I say simply advisedly because it wasn't simple, but we had to describe the entire system in a transparent way so that both our domestic audience but also our international partners would be able to see in to the system and understand it. So we had to particularly make an effort to explain what we often know ourselves internally to the outside world. So description in a coherent and comprehensive way was a key part of it. The second part was more formal. That was simply to get the stated agreement of all of the formal quality assurance bodies to the process, and they did that, all 6 bodies.